Hey everybody, and welcome to Jim's Garage. Today is the first in what's probably going to be 3 videos focusing on OpnSense. I'm going to start off with the beginner steps of installation and hardware. We're then going to move on to some initial configuration. So we'll cover all the basics, things like subnets, vLANs, VPNs, all that good stuff, before moving on to more advanced configurations, such as high availability. Yeah, that's right, running 2 in a failover mode. But before we do that, let's set the scene. So if you're watching this video, the entry level one, you might be thinking, I've heard about firewalls, what are they and why might I want one? Well, because you've heard of OpnSense, you've probably done a bit of research. Now, OpnSense is an open source, FreeBSD based firewall that is next generation because it has a host of advanced features and a number of plugins that you can go to further enhance the initial default configuration. So the reason you might want a firewall, or the reason I advocate you do get a firewall, is because you want to protect your network. Now, as you're doing home labbing, you're probably going to want to be externalizing services, or at least playing with advanced features. Now, anything you're externalizing is going to be attacked. That's just a fact. But I don't want to cause undue concern. 99% of the time, probably higher than that, it's just going to be automated bots that are trying to access your service. And any up-to-date firewall should be able to deal with that without issue. However, in the odd case that it doesn't manage to do that, a firewall brings with it numerous benefits, such as microsegmentation, segmenting your network so that if an attack is successful, hopefully that attack cannot propagate through your network. There's also a whole host of other things like intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, SSL scanning, all of that kind of stuff that we'll come on to later in the videos. Now, there are a number of firewalls out there, and OpnSense is probably the most popular within the home labbing community. If you've watched any of my videos, you'll know that I use Sophos XG, but after this series, I've already done the prep for this. I'm seriously considering jumping over to OpnSense. That should hopefully become evident as we get into the video series because it's super capable and it's a really attractive, easy to use GUI. So to build a firewall, you've basically got 2 options. You can either do what's called a bare metal, so that's just like building a dedicated computer as a firewall. That's great. Or you can do a virtual machine approach. That's what I'll be covering in this video through the demonstration, but the setup and the process will be exactly the same for a physical setup. Now for a hardware, I'll cover both physical and virtual, albeit virtual you've probably got the hardware. For a physical setup, you don't need anything fancy. For a minimum setup, I recommend at least 2 cores and 4 GB of RAM, although the official documentation says you can get away with less. Obviously, if you want more of the features enabled, so things like IDS and IPS, and maybe if you have, say, gigabit internet, you probably want to be more at the 4 cores and 8 gigs of RAM end, but your mileage may vary. In terms of hardware, I recommend getting yourself some Intel NICs, those network interface cards, specifically things like the i210 or the i350s. I'll link those in the description below, and I'll also put reference on my GitHub for all the hardware recommendations. And I also recommend, if you want to take this a step further, to have a look at some 10 gig networking options. Things like the Mellanox Connect X series can be picked up for relatively cheap on eBay, but do bear in mind that you'll need to have something like a 10 gigabyte enabled switch to take full advantage of that. For a virtualized setup, you've probably already got a system that's capable, and following the same recommendations for the physical machine, you'll be in a good position. So let's get straight into the deployment process for OpnSense. As I mentioned, I'm going to be deploying this in a virtual setup, but the process for the installation is pretty much identical. We're going to download an ISO first. For a virtual machine, we'll be uploading this to our hypervisor, in this case Proxmox, but if you're going to do this on a physical machine, you'll want to burn that ISO to a USB stick like you would do pretty much any operating system. Now, you might be thinking, why would I want to do this with a virtual setup? Well, the reason for that, in my opinion, is portability. That's one of the key advantages for virtualization. It means that I can seamlessly back up my entire firewall, which comes with all of its configuration, and ultimately restore it even to a new machine if I want to change my host. It also opens up the ability for failover. If you say got a Proxmox cluster with similar hardware, those VMs can fail over, so giving you high availability. And also it enables you to make changes on the fly, so adding new hardware, tweaking existing setups, etc. It's also probably a better use of existing hardware that typically won't be fully utilized. Some people do raise concerns around security, and probably the true purist would state that you should have a firewall on bare metal and that's all it should be doing. From probably an academic standpoint, that's correct, but pretty much everything these days is in the cloud and virtualized, and as long as you take sensible precautions, there shouldn't be really any additional risk that's introduced through virtualization. So with that said, and to just re-establish the fact that the process for this video will be exactly the same, let's head into the deployment and get this thing set up. So the first thing we need to do is head over to the OpnSense website and start the download process for the image. Feel free to have a look around and review all of the features. There's some really cool documentation on there that will give you a feel of what this will be able to do. So head over to the download section and we're going to download the DVD ISO image. Do bear in mind that there are separate images that you can install, so you could have it router on a stick, for example. But as you can see here, we want the DVD ISO image. So from here, select DVD, choose a mirror that makes sense to where you're based, and then just hit the download button. Once that's downloaded, we'll move on to the next stage. So now that that's completed, you can see here that I've got a BZ2 file. Now luckily 7-zip can open that. So whichever unpacker you're using, open it and extract the ISO file, which you'll find here. This is the ISO file that you can then burn to a USB stick if you're doing a physical install. I recommend something like Rufus, I'll link that in the description below. But now that we've got the ISO, as you can see in the background, we're going to upload this to Proxmox so that we can create a virtual machine and specify this image. So heading over to Proxmox, you need to go into one of your nodes. So I'm going to open up this, I'm going to head down to my local storage, and I'm going to select ISO images. So now to get this ISO onto the machine, we just hit upload and then we select the file. So in this case, it was in my downloads, and then I click this, click open, and then I can hit upload and it will start to upload the file. Now typically you can use the download from URL instead of this method, but because it's that BZ2 compressed file, Proxmox doesn't understand what to do with it. So we need to unpack it and use the ISO method that we're doing here. So hit upload, and when that's done, it should show in the background like this one here. Great, if it shows there, you're ready to move on to the next step. So what we're going to do is now set up a virtual machine that'll eventually look something like this. So to do that, we're going to create a virtual machine, choose the node that you want it to be on if you have more than one. I'm going to call this one OpnSense Test. I'm going to start it at boot. You don't have to do that, that's optional. It does what it says on the tin. And that's all we need to change for this part. I'm going to hit next. Now I'm going to choose the image that we just uploaded. So as you can see, I've actually got my NAS mounted to my Proxmox because I use that as a storage backup and for larger, just more general storage. If you don't know how to go and do that, you can check out my video where I specify how to do that. I'm going to change this from TrueNAS to local. Remember, that's where we put the ISO. And now hopefully all of those ISOs are available to select. And here you can see OpnSense DVD. So we're going to click that. Then we're going to hit next. The system is fine as it is, and you can click next. Now there is a move towards everything being Q35 and using the OVMF BIOS. And OpnSense does officially support that. However, there is a note on their site that says this is quite new and it isn't fully tested. So I'm going to keep it simple and use the default and hopefully we can migrate this at a later time when we're comfortable. Moving on to the disks, this is what it says. This is where it's going to install the data for OpnSense. So for my setup, I have 4 NVMe drives in a RAID 10, and we'll come on to that in a minute when we go through the installation process as to what those different versions are. Basically, it gives me half the storage, but it gives me redundancy. So if a drive fails, I'm in a good spot. To select that, I need to hit the storage, and I'm going to choose NVMe. So that's my quad NVMe card. I want to do SSD emulation. I want to enable discard, because that enables some of the more advanced features of SSDs, and it enables Proxmox to reclaim some of the unused or deleted space. So we're going to click next. Then we come on to the core count. Now this will be dependent on your hardware, and as I said, I recommend you use 4 cores. So because mine's a multi-socket system, I'm going to use 2 sockets, 2 cores, which gives me 4. I'm going to change the type to be the host so that it gets all the features of the host CPU. Because it's spread across 2 sockets, I'm going to enable NUMA, but if you've just got the 1 socket, just give it 4 cores, select host, and you don't need to do anything else. So let's click next, and then it's going to ask for memory. Now I'm going to untick a ballooning device, because that won't work if you're using hardware pass-through. And also I like to pin my RAM so that I don't get into unexpected scenarios where there might be too much requests for RAM and then VMs start failing. So I'm going to change this to 4 GB and then hit next. You can obviously increase both the CPU and the memory later on if, say for example, you have more users on your system, or maybe you upgrade your internet and you find that the old one is struggling. That's more difficult if you've got a physical machine, but it should still be possible. Next, we come on to the network. Now, I'm just going to skip this for now and click next, because we'll go into the network section in a moment, because I'm going to assume that you've got multiple NICs and you want to select the right one for the WAN and the LAN. You're going to need a minimum of 2 to make this work, but I'm going to set up 3 because in later videos we're going to set up high availability, and I want to set that on its own dedicated interface. You don't have to, but that's the way I'm going to do it. Now that we come to the confirmation screen, just double check that everything you've set is right and what you expect, and when you're ready, hit finish. That's going to go away now and create that new virtual machine. And as you can see, it's over here, OpnSense test, and that's created. And from the go, that looks right. 4 CPUs, 4 gigs of RAM, and that default 32 gigs of space. That's more than enough for this setup, and you can always increase it if you need to. So remember, I've said you need a minimum of 2 NICs, and if we go to the hardware tab, you can see we've only got 1. So we need to sort that out. And also, this is using the Virtual Bridge 0, which is actually the NIC that my Proxmox host itself use, and good practice dictates that you don't want to share that interface. So I'm going to head over now to Proxmox Dell, so my actual machine, and then I'm going to hit the Network tab. This lists all of the NICs that are on my Proxmox box. Now, there's probably more here than you have on yours if you're just starting out, and let me explain what this is. So these 4 here, the ENPs, so that is a quad port 1 gigabit NIC. So each port is 1 gigabit and it's RJ45, so your standard Ethernet connection. ENO 1 to 4 are SFP plus 10 gigabit. So I've got 4 10 gig ports on this machine and 4 1 gig ports on this machine. Now, it doesn't really matter too much about the speed. You can always upgrade that in the future. And the beauty of virtualization means that you can actually just swap out the network cards and assign the same VMBR to it, and you don't have to worry about it breaking or any driver issues within the virtual machine, because we're going to set it up to be defaultly para-virtualized. It doesn't see what it is under the hood. So what you need to do now is to go to create, and then you want to create a Linux bridge. Now, give this a name. It's going to defaultly populate this, and you want to set which bridge port it's set to. Now, you'll want to do 1 VMBR to 1 bridge port. So what you'll end up with is something like this. You can see that VMBR 0 is on ENO 1, VMBR 1 is on ENO 2, and so forth. I've got a one-to-one relationship with those. Now, for the firewall, I recommend that your WAN is obviously unique and it can't be used by anything else. And I recommend the same for your LAN. So you'll see on the right hand side here, I've put some comments in so I know which is which. And because it's often quite difficult to know physically, the ports aren't always in a logical order. On the right hand side, I've labeled where they are on the card because the order isn't logical and it can be jumbled up. So port 1 doesn't necessarily become F1. You get the idea. So there is a handy tool called ftool, Ethernet tool, which you can actually run some commands and it will blink the LEDs for these specific network interface cards, so you'll be able to easily identify which one you're plugging into. So now if I zoom out so you can see the right hand side, sorry it's a bit small, you can see here that for the one I currently have set up over here, OpnSense, I've assigned VMBR6 to F2 and VMBR7 to F3. And I've also labeled that this one's going to be the WAN and this one's going to be the LAN. So as I said before, I'm going to use 3 network interface cards on my OpnSense because in later videos we're going to do high availability and I want that as a dedicated NIC. Now you don't actually have to do that physically within Proxmox. That's because whilst you do need 2 physical, one for the WAN and one for the LAN, actually that high availability link could just be another instance of the LAN card because we can use a VLAN to separate the traffic. So with those 2 set up, this is the bare minimum configuration. Feel free to go and set up a HA if you need to. We can head over into OpnSense now and we can click on hardware and then we can click add. And in add, we want to add a network device. Now, if you remember, we can set up VMBR6 for the WAN and we can click add. And then we can click the other one, which was VMBR7 for the LAN. So here I drop down and I get the LAN. And then I can click add. Now, the default we probably don't want to have, so I'm going to remove that one. And we've now got the 2. We've got the LAN and the WAN. And as I said before, if we want to add another one, we can go to network device. And then, as I said, I can put the HA onto the LAN. So I can click that one again and then just click add. And so now I've got another interface, albeit it's assigned to the same physical port. So we're going to need some VLANs in future videos, but let's not complicate this one anymore. So now when I boot this up for the first time, it's going to see 3 network interface cards. And as you can see here, they've all got separate MAC addresses. Great. So I'm going to shut down the one I've already got running as my test because it's going to be using the same network cards. And I'm going to spin up the new one and guide us through the whole setup stage. So I'm going to shut this one down and then I'm going to start the deployment. So now we're ready to click on our virtual machine and we're ready to go to the console and we can hit start. Now, the first time you hit start on OpnSense, it's going to install or it's going to run in what's called live mode. So don't think that that's installed, it's just running in memory. What we actually need to do is to force it to install. I'll show you how to do that once this is booted up. One thing that's handy is that you can see at the bottom, press any key to start the configuration path from an existing config. So do note that that's a really useful feature if for whatever reason your firewall breaks, you'll then be able to recover hopefully your config and import it into a new machine so you don't have to start from scratch. Now it might be timing out during this process because at the moment I don't have anything plugged into my WAN or LAN interfaces. If it does look like it's hanging, just give it time, this will pass. But if you're already confident and you know which ones your LAN and WAN port are going to be, you could just plug this into your ISP router or modem and it should pick that up and continue much quicker. So now we've come to the end of the installation, or at least the startup. As I mentioned, it isn't actually installed yet, it's running in memory. And if you read the welcome message on the screen in front of you, you can see that we need to log in as the user installer to start this installation process. So let's log in as the installer, and the password, quite handily, is OpnSense. So I'm going to type that password in and get on to the next step. So hitting return, we should now go into the GUI. So I'm going to continue with the default key map for my keyboard, that's fine. And then we get onto the technical configuration for installation. Now, the only two real options you need to worry about on this screen are the install UFS and ZFS. Now, because my machine is already using a RAID drive, which is actually ZFS, I'm just going to do the UFS method. Now, that's probably what you're used to if ever you've installed, say, bare metal before. You're just going to install it onto a drive. If, however, you want some redundancy in your firewall setup, either physically or virtually, perhaps you want to pass through two drives. And what you can do in that sense is set up a mirror so that you have two copies of your data on two separate hard drives, SSDs, whatever they might be. I'm going to show you how to do this with UFS because my underlying hardware, as I said, is already RAID. So I'm going to hit return on UFS, and then I need to select the drive that I pass through. Now, we know it's not 1 gig, that's the actual ISO we've mounted, so it must be the one below, which is 32 gig. And if you remember going back to where we created the virtual machine, it was 32 gigs. So I'm going to select down and hit OK. It's going to ask if we want to continue with a default swap size of 8 gig. That's fine. I'm going to hit OK. And are you sure you're going to lose all of your data at this point? So yes, in my instance, we know it's a clean drive. And then it's going to go away, wipe those, and then do the installation, which is actually going to copy from the live installation onto this disk we've just partitioned. So I'm going to cut the video here and join you on the other side once this is completed. So now that's completed, we're asked if we want to change the root password. Obviously, I recommend you change that from OpnSense, but for this video, I'm going to ignore it, I'm going to exit and reboot. Now that this is rebooting, you should be in a position, if you haven't already, to plug your machine, i.e. the one that you're probably on right now, into the LAN port on the OpnSense router. So now you can see that this is booting up for the first time and it's reading it from the hard drive instead of the DVD ISO. And once this is completed, it should be able to pick up an IP address. You'll be able to plug your current machine into the LAN port or into the switch that's then plugged into the LAN port, and we should be able to then access the web GUI. So here you can see that I've got the LAN, which is the 1.1. So when I plug my machine into the LAN port, the GUI for OpnSense should be accessible on that IP address. Now, I haven't actually connected my WAN port yet, so it's not picking up an IP address for the internet. We'll solve that in a minute. So I'm going to now plug into the LAN port from this machine into the new OpnSense virtual machine, and fingers crossed we should be able to access the OpnSense GUI. So now in my browser, if I head to 192.168.1.1, I should reach the GUI. Now this is a good sign, albeit we do get a warning. That's because it's using a self-signed certificate, but we can ignore that. So let's proceed. And voila, we've now reached the GUI for OpnSense and we can begin the initial configuration wizard. So we're going to log in with root, and the password will be whatever you specified at the end of the wizard. In my case, I left it as OpnSense. So I'm going to hit login. So starting the initial configuration. So I'm going to click next. Now you're going to want to set up a few things on this page. Firstly, you want to set the DNS servers. Now, if you're using something local like a Pi-hole or an AdGuard, you want to specify those values here. However, if you don't have those set up yet, I recommend you use something like Cloudflare, so 1.1.1.1 and Quad 9, the clue's in the title. Those will typically be better than your ISP provided DNS resolvers. You possibly want to put on DNSSEC for security on DNS and then hit next. Next, it's going to ask what time servers you want to use, because obviously anything with a firewall, making sure that the timestamps are aligned is critical. So choose your time zone and then hit next. Next, it's going to ask you to configure the WAN port. Now, the WAN port is your internet port, and typically you're going to be giving a DHCP lease, so it should automatically pick up your IP address. However, different modes are supported, so static if you've got a static IP address, PPOE, PPPT, etc. And you'll need login credentials, certainly for PPOE. I'm just going to leave it as DHCP because mine's designed to pick it up automatically from the ISP, and I don't want to go down this route too much, but I'm currently behind my Sophos XG, so this is going to pick up an internal IP address on my WAN port. Don't worry about that. The MAC address you can set here to spoof things. We can change all of this later. I'm just going to keep this simple to get you up and running. There shouldn't be anything else we need to configure in this, but if you did need to configure it, here you can put in your static IP address details, etc., upstream gateway, and all of those things. I'm going to assume you know what those are if you've chosen to go down a static IP route anyway. So scrolling down to the bottom, I'm going to hit next. Next, we do exactly the same as we did for the WAN, but on the LAN. And this is going to be the IP address for OpnSense. So I'm going to leave this as 1.1, and I'm going to leave the subnet mask of 24. That gives us 254 usable IP addresses within this address range. You can obviously change this to whatever you want, but if you change it and don't have DHCP enabled, you might temporarily lock yourself out. So hit next. Then you can keep the current password or change it. I'm going to keep it as is for this demonstration. And fingers crossed we hit reload. It's probably going to knock you off the GUI, but when it reboots up, you should be back now on the dashboard. So I'll let this do its thing and I'll see you on the other side. That was actually much quicker than I thought. So I recommend the first thing you do is check for updates. So it's going to go away, pull down those updates, and you should then be up to running on the latest version. So once you've had a read through here, if you're that way inclined, scroll all the way to the bottom and just click the update button. OK. This is the bit where it's probably going to throw you out of the firewall, it's going to restart, but there are messages on screen to tell you exactly what it's doing. So now that install's coming to an end, and it's likely going to have to reboot some of those components and refresh the web UI. So now it's said that its upgrade is finished and the device is being rebooted. So let's stay patient and wait for it to come back online. So now that's completed and I've been taken back to the login page. So let's log back in. And then hopefully we go straight to the dashboard. And so if you followed those steps closely, fingers crossed, you're in this position now. We have OpnSense up and running, and as you can see, there's CPU usage, there's traffic flowing through the network, everything looks fine. So let's validate that we've got some connectivity. You can do that by just opening up any web browser, running a ping, whatever it may be. And so if we go to the best website in the world, you can see here that I now have internet access, and all of this traffic is being routed through OpnSense. And we can validate that by going to some of the system logs and checking the traffic. So if I now go over to reporting and click traffic, you'll see that there's traffic coming in and out of the network. And so for example, if I run something like a speed test, we'll be able to see this get maxed out. So if I head to fast.com, run that, you'll see here instantly I'm getting a spike. So everything is up and running and working, and even things like DNS resolution is taking place because it could resolve fast.com. Brilliant. So now you have OpnSense up and running, and that's going to conclude this video. As I said, I'm going to be going into the next step where we're actually going to configure this and make use of it. So in the next video, we're going to be looking at things like subnets, VLANs, VPNs, etc. And I'll show you how to configure all of those. So a quick wardrobe change later, but I hope you found that video both interesting and accessible. Now, I know my setup is slightly complicated due to the use of multiple NICs and an existing setup, but really all you need is 2 NICs that are dedicated to OpnSense, and the high availability option is optional. So hopefully you'll join me on the next video, where we're going to begin to configure OpnSense and touch on all of the things that have probably attracted you to OpnSense in the first place. So things like VLANs, yes, you're going to need a VLAN capable switch to do that. Things like VPNs, network segmentation and subnets, And eventually we're going to move on to high availability, so we can replicate this setup across physical nodes to give us redundancy, failover, and something that is really useful, the ability to reboot your servers without knocking out the internet for yourself and, more critically, the rest of the family. Anyway, take care guys, please give this a like and a subscribe if you found this useful, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care everybody.